Our next speaker is Justin Siegel. Justin is an operations executive and entrepreneur specializing in technology, startup companies, and real estate investment and management. He is the president of Boxer Property, a privately held commercial real estate company focused on office, hospitality, retail, and collaborative space. He is also the founder of Stemmons Enterprise, a universal operations platform that allows companies to operate with pervasive data, organized processes, and a single view of everything. Justin often speaks on topics involving enterprise data, analytics, artificial intelligence, and the effective integration of technology into everyday work. He has served on the board of trustees at Yes Prep Public Schools and the board of Glasstire. He is a member of the Realcomm CIO Advisory Council and sits on the boards of Sketch City, Glasstire, and the Lawndale Arts Center. He is a member of the International Academy of Digital Arts and Sciences.
Hello, everybody. So today we're going to talk about some macro trends that are going on and how they inform your technology roadmap. We're going to start with a little timeline where we can kind of lay out a framework for what we're going to talk about, and we'll start with the past and kind of go ahead to the future. And just for context, I'll say we've seen kind of the coronavirus come and we're in the now portion. Okay, so let's go back in time a little bit and think about how business was in the past. First of all, I'd say, there was a time when access to capital was probably the biggest determinant of how a company could be successful. Of course, now there's capital markets that are much more effective, but back in the day, we used to see things like transportation and natural resources, perhaps some banking, agriculture. These were the kinds of businesses that were big and successful and really dominated our business world. The pride of the company was often how long it had been around. Longevity was key, and that really came through in how they saw their reputations and their place in the business world. It also showed up in the types of buildings that they built. So, here's the Pantheon from 27 AD. Almost 2,000 years later, we're seeing the Girard Trust building effectively the exact same thing as, calling from antiquity. And companies got bigger during this time. Here's the list of biggest companies in 1917. There was a wave of consolidation, conglomerates came out, and, bigger was better in many ways. And that showed up, in the way the companies were structured. Not a lot of medium-sized companies compared to today, not a lot of freelancers and so forth. And it also showed up in the buildings. So this is a theoretical stacking plan, but you would have a large commercial office building with a bunch of large customers, and they took big blocks of space so they could all be together. In fact, one of the things that was very important back in the day was physical proximity, right? There was no substitute for being close to people. There were no fax machines. There were, maybe telephones eventually, but if you wanted to be near things like your products or communicate or be able to move around or have information, you really had to be in physical proximity. And this was a huge driver of how companies organize themselves, both within an organization and also kind of in collaboration with other companies that they would deal with. And that same situation really has persisted. This is a view of New York, from approximately the same vantage point hundreds of years later. And, you're still seeing kind of a very, very similar focus on proximity. Things have stayed that way for a long time and given rise to what we think of as kind of the modern urban metropolis, right? Of course, at a certain point, automobiles came along. Everybody had cheap access to transportation and interstate highways, and you wound up with something that kind of looked like this. The offices would be in the high density central business district areas. Maybe there's a trolley or a subway or some public transit around that space. And of course, up pops a whole bunch of suburbs, and people would live in these bedroom communities and drive into work. And this was kind of the mode that we were in. And it doesn't matter if you're in New York, and people are coming in from Long Island and New Jersey and Connecticut and Westchester, or if we're in Los Angeles or Dallas or really any modern city, the experience was kind of the same, right? You'd have huge tracts of houses where a huge number of people would live. They would commute into work in a car. They would jump onto a subway to get to their office, or maybe a streetcar. They would work in a large office with a lot of physical proximity to each other, and they would do that for a long time until they got their gold watch. And congratulations, they retired. And this is what the world looked like from the standpoint of conducting business. And that's what it looked like kind of back in the day. And in large part, it's pretty much what it's looked like until quite recently. And in fact, even till today, you notice in 1890 they had a dog. They were very ahead of the curve with their office policies. But basically, we've been operating in a very similar way. Now, I'll admit that under the surface, things have been changing, right? We have seen a wave of innovation. We've got computers and internet and cloud and mobility and automation, and all those kinds of things have been happening. But at the same time, if we look at the roles of the landlord and the tenant, we see a pretty good division between them, and it's a pretty permanent barrier in a lot of ways. So we have historically the tenants on one side, the landlords on the other, and they're kind of interacting together in the context of a traditional downtown office tower with, uh, a pretty predictable layout. Okay, so the tenants have their things. They have a centralized location, like they have a big office somewhere everyone's coming in. They've got long-term plans. They've got large blocks of space. They're responsible for the culture of their company and their office. The landlord just gives them, essentially four walls and a door. And the landlord, for their part, have a small number of users. They're credit tenants typically. And you could think of the landlord as somewhat leveraging their balance sheet. They're putting up money today to build and buy the building, to build out the space, to pay the broker. And then the tenant pays over time. And in addition, the landlord's job is really to focus on the facility and the infrastructure. So this is what we were doing for a long time. And although things were changing under the surface, the general pattern was pretty similar until, along comes, boom, the coronavirus. And, we've kind of seen how that has gone, and we know where we are today. It seemed like a small thing, but it touched off a lot of things that have had potentially and will have potentially profound impacts on our business. So the first thing that happened was everybody got all excited about work from home, not the landlords. The landlords got unexcited about it because, there were all these conversations about, hey, what's going to happen? No one needs an office anymore. The reality, I think, is very different. People don't actually have offices like that in their home. It looks great, but the reality is much more like there's a lot of distractions, and there's bad ergonomics, and your back is hurting, and there's, your pets are around, and isolation, which doesn't get enough talk time, I think. But working from home is a very socially isolating experience, and there's a lot of depression and anxiety, and uh, you know people want to be connected, and when they're working from home, they're not in the same way. And let's not forget that work from home kind of sounds okay for existing teams because everybody knows each other and they know the company culture. But when you throw in new people, they're not already connected, right? So I think the work from home thing is not going to be the long-term issue. But I will tell you, there's something else that did happen that is a much bigger story, and it's not about working from home, but it is about commuting, right? And I think that the genie is out of the bottle. People know and understand that commuting totally sucks. And to the extent that a company can offer somebody an experience at the workplace that doesn't involve commuting, that company will be in a much better position to keep and attract and retain that employee. So if we look at kind of a time study about the effect of a commute on the amount of time that parents have with their children, if you take a 60-minute commute with a bunch of assumptions about bedtime and what time kids go to school and so forth, and then you shave that down to 30 minutes each way. Okay, what you end up with is a 67% increase in the amount of time that the parents spend with the children, and that goes directly to the family, right? So time uh, commuting is going to be very difficult to reinstate, I believe. And I think what you'll find is that people want to work closer to where they live. The other thing that's a real byproduct of our experience with COVID is this concept of physical proximity. In the past, we understood it as being expensive because that density is very expensive. And risky because you're kind of placing all your eggs in one basket. And if there's an interruption in a city, there's no resiliency and diversification in the portfolio of office space, but people thought it was necessary, and some things are really changing that now. The first is cheap connectivity. I mean, we can connect to any information anywhere at any time with virtually no cost. I mean, the cost of connectivity is really not a big issue on anybody's budget. We also have collaborative platforms that we never had before, the ability to stay in touch with people and understand what's going on. And then finally, this kind of concept of cultural convergence. It used to be that, even within a country or a state, there were big differences between different parts, different geographies. And now the truth is everybody in the world is essentially consuming the same set of pop culture and has the access to the same information, and language skills are democratized. And so this convergence, along with connectivity and platforms, allows us to have a very different attitude about proximity. And you see this coming out. Here's some just kind of current news. Another big tech company leaves San Francisco. California has a net drop in population. And in the meantime, we have places that are rising stars like Greenville and Des Moines and Provo. And so what we're seeing is that the high density, high cost markets are in decline, and the lower density, lower cost markets are in the upswing. And you can see this kind of on a micro level as well, right? Where companies are now adding offices in their suburban locations and changing the footprint of how they interact, how their business is structured, right? So you can think of this a little bit like the airline model of having a hub and a spoke. And on one hand, a company could operate in a more local or regional way, where they could say, well, we're in one city, but we're going to put offices in the suburbs all around it, or in a part of the country, or companies can go national and start kind of operating on the East Coast and the West Coast and a bunch of places in the middle. And then increasingly what we're seeing is companies operating on an international scope. Okay, so you could be a regional carrier, or you could go all the way for international. Why would a company do international? I mean, what are the benefits of that? It's pretty significant and worth a little bit of time and attention. So if we think about, here's a 24-hour clock, how most companies operate. Okay, you have the US day. We're talking about US companies. There's productive time, and then the rest of the time is non-productive. And what you wind up with is basically the company is functioning for 33% of the time. If you add a shift on the other side of the world, somewhere in Asia, suddenly, what you wind up with is 67%. And if you add swing shifts in the middle to kind of bridge those gaps, then you wind up with 100% productive time. And if you think about that as being 2x, 3x rather, the kind of normal amount of time that a company has to work, it's pretty significant. So you get to operate 24 hours, you get to reduce your costs, there's more things you can do. And this is a big one, you can find and chase talent. You can find pockets of talent, not only all over the country, but all over the world. And so this is the legacy, I think, of our experience with the pandemic, is it's unleashed a lot of opportunities, and it's kind of remapped the way companies can be successful. So the success factors that we're looking at today, that were kind of there before the pandemic, but coming out in a very strong way now, you've got to be really good at data and analytics, right? Product development, product life cycles have to be compressed and very nimble, not to mention your very agile teams. And of course, being able to have a flexible supply chain is huge. And these are the things that are making companies successful today, much more than, the natural resources and access to capital and kinds of things and proximity that we saw before. So let's take a look at what this does for real estate. Okay, in the words of immortal David Bowie, there are changes, right? And we have these things happening: the de-densification, the hub and spoke models, the internationalization of teams, smaller offices, and companies valuing flexibility in a pretty significant way. So if you take that and remember and recall the traditional role of landlords and tenants, where it was very clear, what was pink and what was green and who did what, and think about how that's looking now, it is changing pretty dramatically. And things are a lot more discombobulated, and the normal roles just aren't quite the same. Now, there's been some kind of, I would call it in a polite way, freaking out about this, like that Bill Murray scene from Ghostbusters, um, where it's mass hysteria, and it can feel like that a little bit as things are getting remapped. But the truth is, we can really plan for this, and we can figure out how these larger macro trends will impact our actual needs as a company. So let's look at it from each participant's point of view. Okay, we start with the landlords. We said, okay, back then we've kind of gone through the larger users and stuff that we mentioned. Um, what we're seeing now is a very different kind of profile, right? There's a lot more distributed users, shorter leases. The building looks like something that a kid would make out of a bunch of random pieces of Lego. And suddenly the landlord is responsible for the culture and the amenities and the art in the building and the experience, because with smaller users that don't have 5 floors of space, if the landlord doesn't do it, nobody will. So what a landlord needs today, and the things we should be thinking about, are things like a capability or tool to do flexible space management. Okay, the ability to create a culture for the property and a sense of place. It's not just a piece of art in the lobby anymore. It's community, it's management of the experience, it's customer engagement, very important. And then from a financial standpoint, the flexibility really changes the underwriting and modeling that a landlord needs to do. And there has to be some systems to accommodate that. There has to be a much more flexibility than the traditional underwriting models. Automating transactions is important. Doing things like having online booking, to reserve conference room spaces, order food, maybe, change your access rights, so on and so forth, all very important. And finally, the direct leasing model, becomes a lot more important and interesting when we start dealing with flexible, very changing and distributed users. On the other side of the coin are the tenants. Okay, so historically the tenants would have like one big space with a bunch of floors in an office. Now, we're seeing a different pattern. Maybe they still keep one of their 5 floors, but they have a bunch of different offices that are distributed maybe around the country or even distributed around the world. Okay, and to the extent that that's happening, the needs of the occupier, this is really basically any business with any scale or even not that much scale, but you know first of all, companies need flexible spaces, and they need to find landlords that are willing to provide that flexibility. They also need mobility solutions so that their employees can work from all these different places and be a lot more mobile than they were before. Obviously, cybersecurity becomes a much bigger concern for a company that's operating in a distributed way, and data. So having a data warehouse or some kind of facility for centralized and normalized data is critical. And on top of that, there needs to be something that drives collaboration, and that's more than just email or Slack or something like that, but it has to be something that allows for structure and workflow and process design, and of course, keeping track of who's doing what where. Because when we don't have the proximity, now we're relying on systems to understand those things. A learning management system comes in very, very handy. And then finally, there are some changes to how we staff and recruit and kind of manage and host our employees, and having some opportunity to have distributed staffing is really important. And of course, all of this change that's happening all the time on a regular basis means we need to be in the world of continuous strategic planning. And that means we need some tools for it, because you can't set a 5-year plan and look at it once a year anymore. It's really got to be a live thing, and that requires a comprehensive system and approach to take care of that. So we've gone from talking about kind of the distant past. We were a couple thousand years ago. Now we're talking about the near future. I'm very happy to answer any questions or be contacted offline. And again, I'm Justin Siegel. The companies I work with are Boxer Property, a real estate company, Stemmons Enterprise, a software company, Relay is a staff hosting business, and Workstyle is our flexible space platform. And my email is included there. So thank you, and I hope this kind of conversation about macro trends will help inform your technology roadmaps as it has our own. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. That was a great session.